I've been struggling to write this review for several days now, and out of desperation I decided to try and look at other people's coverage of the game to maybe spark some inspiration in myself, only to find that a lot of that coverage was actually pretty lacking.
Each review I stumbled upon had maybe a paragraph or so commenting on each of the general aspects of the game that you would expect, barely touching on the topics that I generally attempt to delve into on a deeper level, but found myself floundering with for this very video. The only similarly grand portion of each of these reviews was a deconstruction of the now infamous character development system, which was also the only part of the game that I knew how to approach at the outset.
I sat and thought on this for quite a while. Why is it that people are able to talk about Final Fantasies 1 and 3 so easily, but can't seem to figure out what to say about Final Fantasy 2? Most people talk about the character development system and then just write the game off as bad from the outset, but doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose of being a critic or reviewer?
Now, I'm not defending the game or trying to say that the game is good. It is infamous for a reason, and the level up system is the foundation that causes the rest of the game to sit off kilter, but it's not everything the game has to offer, and to that end, it's not the only thing that should be talked about.
I guess the point of this introduction is to admit that I was struggling to review this game at first too, because on the surface, it doesn't look like there's very much to dissect. The truth of the matter is, Final Fantasy II is subpar, but not because of a lack of ambition or creativity. That's why I decided to do something a little bit different with this video.
Since we already know that the game is of poor quality, I wanted to do more than just list the reasons why. While yes, I'm going to touch on all the aspects that are usually criticized about the game, I want to take things a step further here by discussing the developer's intent versus their implementation, giving more insight into what I think the developers were aiming for with this title, and discuss a bit about how context can affect the way we view things. Without further ado, let's start Stiles series synopsis of Final Fantasy II.
While I couldn't find a lot of information on Final Fantasy II's development cycle, I did find enough information to point out where all the problems stem from.
You see, Final Fantasy II was in development for less than a year, which gave the developers very little time to playtest and polish the game. If the tight schedule wasn't enough, the team faced even more adversity when partway through the game's development, the main programmer's work visa expired, forcing him to fly back to his home in Sacramento, California, with just a small team to help him complete the title. This, as we know in retrospect, left the game rather buggy, and most of the ideas implemented less than fully realized.
On December 17, 1988, Final Fantasy II was released, and despite everything I said at the beginning of this video and the mass negative perception that's been cultivated over time, it was actually praised rather highly when it came out.
This revelation alone brings up a rather interesting topic. The game was littered with bugs, especially in the original NES version, and it contains the same basic gameplay systems that even the newest release, which is the one I'm currently reviewing, contains. So what has changed between then and now that makes people view the game in such a different light? I feel there are a few factors actually, the first being rather simple. The fact that the internet is so commonplace now means that the spread of information and opinions has fundamentally changed the way media is seen and consumed. For one example, the majority of the game's bugs likely weren't noticed at all by the common player back then, and those who did find them couldn't post on a forum to make these issues known on a mass scale. In addition, the fact that the genre was still young meant that people were willing to accept some pitfalls for the sake of innovation. Not to mention quality control of games at the time was rather spotty to begin with, so people were inclined to just accept things as they were. While I do think all of these things are factors, I don't think it was the key component. From what I can tell, while time and perception played a large role in the game's original reception, it had very little to do with the opinions of the game's mechanics, and far more to do with the popularity of the game's story. Reportedly, Final Fantasy II was built from the ground up around its story as opposed to its predecessor, which built the world and gameplay first, and I'm inclined to believe that based upon how the game plays out. From the outset, you are thrust into a battle with unbeatable adversaries and are left to die. Luckily, 3 of the 4 main protagonists are rescued by a rebel group fighting back against the very empire that left you for dead and destroyed your hometown. From there, the tale is your standard rebel forces versus the empire story with all the usual plot beats.
Now before we go any further with this, I feel that I should at least give you some kind of spoiler warning, but there's nothing you really need to worry about. Unlike Final Fantasy I, I feel no real need to dissect this plot. First off, because it's a plot that you've seen in every form of media by this point. And the second reason being, the game isn't at all subtle.
Gee, I wonder who this man with the familiar voice is. Who could it possibly be? Ooh. On that same token, Final Fantasy II is only the barest amount of character development, which I suppose compared to its predecessor was still an improvement. The characters have names, they have a shared motivation, and they have speech patterns, which I suppose indicates personality. I was never able to get attached to any of these characters, and I honestly don't see anyone else getting attached either, but at least there are characters and not just blank slates. Anyway, looping back around to the beginning of this section, Final Fantasy II was highly acclaimed for its time due to its story, even winning Famitsu's award for Best Scenario in 1989 in an article about the best games of all time. This is where context becomes incredibly important. While the rundown I just gave you on the game's plot is not all that interesting by today's standards, in the realm of gaming it was rather complex for a game crammed onto an NES cart. I'd even argue that it was one of, if not the, most complex story to appear in a video game at all on consoles at the time. Yes, I hear you PC gamers, shut up. With the exception of perhaps Phantasy Star, which appeared on the Sega Master System a year prior. Speaking of which, I really need to sit down with this series. Is it any good? Whatever, I can talk about that later.
The sad fact of the matter is that video game storytelling has improved so much since then that Final Fantasy II's story no longer holds up, even though it absolutely nails the theming and atmosphere. Which is what I'd like to talk about next, so let's delve into that, shall we?
While the plot in itself isn't all that interesting, it really succeeds at driving the game forward by being intrinsically tied to the quest structure. Each mission you go on acts as a logical step towards succeeding in your long-term goal of defeating the Empire. For example, towards the beginning of the game you are tasked with collecting mithril so that the rebels can actually craft powerful enough equipment to survive in ground battles with the enemy. Later on, you are tasked with sabotaging the enemy's airship to stop them from being able to bomb any more cities. A lot of people will feel like the game is just one fetch quest after another, and admittedly in some ways it is, but each of these quests is integral to the plan and relevant to the main plot, which is something that some later Final Fantasy games with the same sort of Rebels vs. Empire plot struggle to grasp. Yeah, we did it! Why did we go after the huge materia again? But I'm getting way ahead of myself there. So let's regain focus. The developers at Square really ran with the idea of a grand-scale conflict, attempting to portray a realistically unpleasant representation of war. Party members die throughout the course of your journey, and they die permanently. Entire cities are wiped out, and the game actually shows the scorched remains of said towns, at least in this version of the game. Final Fantasy II succeeds at setting a rather pessimistic tone, which I find even more impressive considering I felt no attachment to any of the game's characters. Far more than the writing, the game's aesthetics and music are what really helped to sell it, which is what brings us to presentation. Final Fantasy II for the PSP uses the same overall aesthetic design as its predecessor, sticking with the sleek and polished design that I adored in that title, but tweaking it to better represent the bleak and foreboding atmosphere that this game desires to bring forth. All of the dungeons rely on natural colors, grays, greens, browns, as a means of reflecting the seriousness of the world's conflict. This unfortunately has the side effect of making a lot of the areas less fun to explore than they otherwise would be, because the majority of the time you walk out of a cave just to enter another samey-looking cave of a slightly different color. Don't get me wrong, the first Final Fantasy had a lot of caves, but it also had underwater ruins, floating castles, active volcanoes, while Final Fantasy II has an airship dungeon. But that's still just all gray, meant to represent utilitarian design. Oh! At one point you get swallowed by Leviathan and he becomes a dungeon, but that dungeon only lasts for 3 or so rooms. I think you get my point. The only real redeeming factor about the dullness of Final Fantasy II's visual design in terms of its dungeons is that they really make the final dungeon stand out. The obnoxiously vibrant pink and purple color scheme, standing in great contrast to the rest of the world, truly paints it as a locale full of mystery and danger. The only other part of the visual design I feel I can comment on are the monster designs, which are a bit of a mixed bag. They're all still highly polished, but I can't help but feel that there isn't a consistent style between them. Some of the monsters are much more cartoony in design and clash rather harshly with the serious tone the game presents, which I admit can be a bit nitpicky, but when the game nails the atmosphere so well in every other aspect, it was still something I found to be distracting. On the other hand, I'm realizing already that when it comes to music, especially in the Final Fantasy series, my videos are going to become rather redundant. Following up on his score from the first Final Fantasy, Nobuo Uematsu crafted another beautiful soundtrack, and in fact one that outshines the original in absolutely every aspect. The melodies are more memorable, the songs hold emotional weight, and it all bolsters up the atmosphere to an amazing degree.
In my opinion, Final Fantasy II's soundtrack is the best of the original trilogy, and it's a real shame that it was attached to such a lackluster game. Final Fantasy II's main gameplay doesn't stray very far from what you'd expect from the genre, except for in a few key areas. Which unfortunately means it's time for me to finally tackle the topic that I've been so diligently avoiding up to this point. The keyword system!
One of Final Fantasy II's more unique features is the keyword system. When talking to important NPCs, you are sometimes required to learn keywords to be used at a later time when talking to other NPCs. I admit that I think it's an interesting idea in theory, but unlike most people I've talked to, I don't think this was an effective system because it adds nothing of value to the game. The keyword system is only used in a few locations, but doesn't require any thought or problem solving. If you talk to someone with a character portrait and they don't say anything useful, you know automatically that you have to use a keyword. It just adds one more pointless step to the dialogue process. I understand that it was an attempt to involve players even more in the story, and if you couldn't tell from watching my videos, I of all people enjoy a bit of role-playing in my games, but it just doesn't work here. I've heard the argument that it causes people to actually pay attention to the dialogue, but I feel that's a poor rationale as well. Players who want to follow the story will pay attention to the dialogue, and those who don't should be able to play the games they choose without being bogged down by an arbitrary system. In fact, if anything, I feel this system actively hurts the game in a few places because the story won't continue at certain points until you backtrack and use the keyword on the right person, even if you already know what your next goal is. While not one of the game's bigger missteps, I still feel that the inclusion of the keyword system was at worst a misguided decision and at best a pointless addition.
Alright, enough stalling. Let's finally get to the often cited train wreck that is Final Fantasy II's character development system.
Final Fantasy II forgoes a traditional leveling system for one that is based around skills. All of your base stats increase as you use a correlating ability. Melee attacks have a chance to increase your strength, using magic raises either your intelligence or spirit, depending on if it is white or black magic that you're using. Which, by the way, this game doesn't label for you this time around, so good luck guessing which is which. It goes even further than that, however, giving you skill levels for particular weapon types and particular spells as they are used, falling somewhere between level 1 to 16 to show your proficiency with each weapon type and spell. Things get a bit more strange, however, when you take into account HP and MP, which require you to expend those points either through taking damage or casting spells to grant you a larger HP and MP pool overall. This is where all the talk about hitting your own party members comes into play, because one of the most effective means of gaining HP quickly is to damage yourself. This sounds like a terrible idea from the offset, but perhaps if I discuss the actual mechanics and the intention, it'll make a bit more sense. You can only gain HP after completing a battle if you've lost a large enough percent of your overall HP in said battle. In other words, the more HP you lose, the better chance you have of increasing the HP pool. The thought process behind this design choice was that just like in real life, you don't get better at something unless you challenge yourself. If you fight weak enemies that can't do any damage to you, then you aren't going to get any more HP by fighting them. This was meant to encourage players to fight battles that were at their level or perhaps even stronger than they are to facilitate faster and larger stat boosts. Unfortunately, there was a bit of an oversight, and the ability to attack your own party members became the safest and most productive means of increasing your stats quickly. It was a decent attempt and a very interesting idea. In fact, many more popular games have since put the system to good use, but ultimately in Final Fantasy II it ended up being too easily exploited to be effective. The real shame here is that Final Fantasy II is one of the most in-depth character progression systems in the entire series, but most people won't even realize all the aspects that lie below the surface. The system is layered with a few intelligent checks and balances. For example, the weight of equipment affects your spell accuracy, though that is something you'll likely not notice without a great deal of trial and error, and it isn't really a problem because simply leveling your spells enough can counteract that issue. As another example, each time you level up a physical stat, you have the chance of losing skill in a mental one or vice versa, meaning that making your characters a jack of all trades is a rather poor idea, even though the game presents itself as one that gives you full customization with no repercussions. In theory, the system is brilliant, but the lack of in-game explanation of these mechanics along with a lack of testing means that it fails to work as intended, and when an upgrade system doesn't work as intended, it becomes very difficult to create balanced encounters in dungeons. When broken down, it's easy to see how such a seemingly small aspect of the game can have a negative impact on the entire experience. There is one more aspect of the character upgrade system that I feel people tend to overlook when talking about this game that I wanted to address now, mostly because it helps in the world building so much. Final Fantasy II staggers your equipment upgrades in a rather strange fashion. Most RPGs give you shops all throughout the game where you can upgrade your equipment, but Final Fantasy II is only a few shops with only a handful of upgrades throughout. From the moment you unlock the mithril equipment, you won't be getting anything better for quite some time, which is a great way of bringing importance to that part of the quest, while also elevating the power of mithril within the game's lore. While there is one more useful equipment shop in the game after this point, it takes a while to get there, and all the equipment there is magical in nature, which makes them feel all the more mythic. Of course, this does create a very odd issue of money accrual seeming all but useless for the entire middle section of the game, but it also gives you the opportunity to stock up on healing items, which is a necessity because enemies in this game love to use status ailments. Speaking of enemies, now feels like the right time to delve into the combat mechanics. Remember how I stated in my Final Fantasy video that magic was rather underpowered compared to physical attacks? Yeah, well Final Fantasy II is the exact opposite problem, and to an even larger extreme. The majority of enemies you face, especially bosses, will have such a high physical defense that melee attacks will be all but useless unless you are lucky enough to get a critical hit, which forces you to have at least one dedicated black mage if you want to have any hope of success. The game's focus on magic continues when we take into account all of the status effect spells, and I can't believe I'm saying this given how much I'd love to have buffs and debuffs as part of the game's strategic offerings, but Final Fantasy II has far too much of a reliance on them. There are 4 different buffs that raise your defense, 3 different buffs that raise attack damage, 2 different types of poisons, etc. It's a bit overkill to say the least, and because of the game's level up system, you have no way of knowing which spells are effective and which aren't until you already spent a significant amount of time leveling them up. Oh, but don't worry, your enemies are quite proficient with them, which means you'll often be left pulling your hair out as you guess at what kind of poison effect you are under, or take a turn to heal your character from being stoned once again. But that's still not all. There's yet another feature that makes magic not just an effective part of your repertoire, but a completely overpowered tactic, and that is the use of the many versions of instant death spells that are available to you. Almost every enemy in the game is susceptible to at least one of these instant death spells, including the majority of the bosses, which destroys all the tension the game would have had. I refuse to take advantage of this in my playthrough, but the issue does exist and is just one more example of the lack of playtesting the game underwent. But don't worry, there's at least one case where magic is less than optimal. Ironically, one of the only spells not worth using is the plot-relevant Ultima, which is all but useless unless you have an entire inventory worth of maxed out level 16 spells, which is completely unnecessary since I obliterated the last boss when my highest magic was only around level 12. So yeah, not really worth it. I'm only pointing this out because I just boasted about how overpowered magic is and I found this turn of events just hilarious. Anyway, moving right along, the developers didn't even take the time to make the final boss a challenge because the game gives you access to a weapon known as the Blood Sword, which not only does damage based upon a max percentage of the enemy's HP, but gives your own players HP in the process. This sword alone can defeat the final boss in just a couple of hits and was yet another item I banned from my main playthrough. The problem is, even if you limit use of all of these items as I did and play the game as it was presumably intended, the game still lacks balance. Sharp difficulty spikes occur at several locations that force you to grind up multiple points, usually for MP. Did I mention the magic is broken yet? On the flip side, there will be occasions where you'll travel through dangerous dungeons only to be met by a boss that you can reasonably kill with only one hit. The whole thing is just a mess. This game does not succeed at making combat fun, that's the bottom line. In terms of exploration, the game still suffers, both in terms of dungeon design and world map travel. As stated before, the presentation makes the dungeons feel samey, and on top of that, the egregious amounts of dead ends and doors that lead to completely empty rooms can be absolutely infuriating. When you move away from the main path, you will often be rewarded with nothing for your efforts, and when you do actually find something in a chest, it's very rarely worthwhile, at least until the late game. But by then, you will already be fed up with the useless items presented to you. If all that weren't enough, the encounter rate is even more horrendous than its predecessor, making the dungeons a chore to travel through instead of the game's source of fun. It's also surprising to note that Final Fantasy II's world map feels much smaller than that of its predecessor, and the quest structure really destroyed any interest I would have had in exploring even if there was something worth finding, which there isn't. The gameplay as a whole just feels like a step backwards from its predecessor. The 3 main draws to JRPGs are combat, exploration, and story, and unfortunately, Final Fantasy II fails at 2 of these and barely passes on the 3rd.
I really wish I could say that this game's bonus content was enough to bring up the quality of the experience, like was the case with Final Fantasy's PSP version, but unfortunately that's just not the case.
The game contains 2 different bonus quests, both of which are rather half-baked, so let's just jump right in, shall we? Soul of Rebirth was a mode originally implemented into the GBA release of the game, and it follows the 4 main characters who died during the main adventure. To make things as concise as possible, the 4 travel through a mirrored version of the final dungeon to confront the other half of the Emperor, his angelic side, so to speak, at the same moment that the main heroes were taking on his demonic side. I hesitate to even call it bonus content when you're literally struggling through the same dungeon only with much weaker characters. Probably not worth your time. The Arcane Labyrinth is only slightly more interesting, creating floors based upon which keywords you present on each floor. I was impressed by the fact that the keyword system was finally put to good use here, but ultimately it's a useless addition as only 4 words, which you get in this dungeon, have any lasting impact, presenting you with the dungeon's true challenges and plotline. To be fair, this bit of plot is the most interesting in the entire game, but it's also completely standalone and is too little too late as far as I'm concerned.
So yeah, unfortunately it's kind of difficult to talk about Final Fantasy II's gameplay without being negative about it. The developers had a lot of great and experimental ideas, but no one ever stopped to think about how it would fit into a compelling whole.
While I started with a different approach when making this video, the goal of Stiles series Synopsis is still to determine whether or not each game holds up today, and the response to that in this game's case is a rather obvious no. I'd be hard-pressed to recommend this game to anyone really, unless you insist upon experiencing every game that Final Fantasy has to offer. I admit that part of me really enjoys this game, or more accurately, enjoys what this game aspired to be. But all the praise I can give regarding its amazing soundtrack, decently explored themes, and of course the introduction of the series' famous Chocobos and Cid, can't defend against the absolute onslaught that is this game's poor design. The game is the lowest selling of any mainline game in the Final Fantasy series, and I hope this video made it a bit more clear as to why that is the case, while also reminding players that good qualities can even be found in underwhelming games. I also hope that this video reminded people to think a bit more about context while examining games or any media really, as these things don't exist in a vacuum, and the events occurring in real life around them could shape the way they are viewed a great deal. Alright, this one was a headache, but it's finally done. I have several shoutouts I want to make for this video. First of all, if you want to see more reviews, check out Minimat Reviews here on YouTube. He has some great stuff. If you like Let's Plays, check out my buddy Dragon Essence. And if you're looking for some written articles instead, go check out Super Game Reviews, an up-and-coming site that is gaining steam fast. Unfortunately, this video ended on a bit of a low note. Luckily, next time on Stiles Series Synopsis, we'll be taking a look at one of the brightest, most colorful, and sickeningly adorable games in the entire series to compensate, Final Fantasy III. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and most importantly, have a good day!